Alrighty. Welcome everyone to Muscle PhD Live Q&As. Always excited to see you all today. We're gonna cover an interesting topic, some advanced training variables today. I think we'll start or mainly focus essentially on something called accommodating resistance. So when we talk about accommodating resistance, what is accommodating resistance? Well, I want you to think about lifting weights, right? What's easier? When you're doing a squat, is it easier at the top or is it harder on the top, right? Well, it's easier on the top. Same thing with a lot of other lifts, right? So why is it easier at the top of a lift? Because you have a greater mechanical advantage on the bench press near the top of the lift compared to like on the bottom of the lift itself. So that being the case, how do we overcome this? Well, what happens is this. Because you have a greater mechanical advantage oftentimes at the top of a lift, or because you start to slow down the top of a lift, your muscles aren't working as hard. So if I look at a bench press, my muscles are working harder in this portion of the lift, and they're not working as hard near the top of the lift. Well, it means we're lowering the window of adaptation. We're not making as many gains. So one way to overcome that is a concept known as accommodating resistance. So accommodating resistance is where you add weight near the end of the lift to make it harder. So let's say, for example, that I'm doing bicep curls. It's easier at the top. Maybe as I come past this point, if I'm training with Charlie, he puts some weight on as I'm coming up near the top of the lift, and then halfway on the way down. And then I lift it normal from the bottom to the top. That's accommodating resistance, and it makes the weight harder. And studies show it makes you grow more. Now, the classical ways to do that are to do things like bands and chains, okay? So, for example, if I'm doing bench press, I put bands on there. The bands are unloaded on the bottom, and as I come up, basically, there's more tension on the bands. And so when I have my greatest mechanical advantage and the weight's usually easiest, the bands add resistance and make it harder, okay? Now, you can also do that with chains. If I'm doing a bench press, the chains are unloaded on the floor, and then as I come up, the chains come off the floor and load the bar, and it becomes harder. Studies show that, in fact, we published a study with Jordan Joy, myself, Dr. Ryan Lowry. We published a study with Jordan Joy in Journal of Strength Conditioning Research with NCAA athletes, and we found that using accommodating resistance bands made them bigger, made them gain more muscle, made them stronger, and made them more powerful. So I think that's a really good technique. And you could even do it on isolation exercises or compound machine exercise, like put a band on when you're doing leg press. Man, I will tell you, it's one of the biggest quad pumps you'll ever get, and you will grow like crazy. So that I think that's I think a cool topic. I think accommodating resistance. How do you incorporate it? Well, typically what we like to do is you do normal weights and just add the bands on there. We recommend periodizing accommodating resistance. So maybe like on week 1, do a light band. On week 2, do a heavier band. Week 3, do a super heavy band, right? So that's kind of accommodating resistance in the overall topic of that. Some people have asked me, should I do accommodating resistance every single day? The answer is probably not. You probably should periodize accommodating resistance, maybe use it once a week, switch off from bands and chains, and things of that nature. So that's kind of the topic of accommodating resistance, and I think, again, the biggest thing about it is it's going to make you gain muscle, it's going to make you gain strength. If you're an athlete, it'll make you gain a lot of power. So anyway, after that, I'll just take some questions.
So we were having some issues with our Instagram connection here. We just got this one rolling again. Don't think we're going to make you redo the entire thing.
Oh, okay.
But what's, like, say, your favorite accommodating resistance method for, say, either size or strength?
Well, okay, so going back for you guys who did miss the accommodating resistance thing, the biggest thing I'm saying is that the weight's easier on the top than it is on the bottom because we have a mechanical advantage on the top. So we add bands or we add chains, and it basically makes the way it accommodates the resistance. So my 3 favorite ways that accommodate resistance, if you don't have any tools, if Charlie and I are doing bicep curls, for example, it's easier on the top. So Charlie's going to push down on the weight on the second half of the lift, and as I'm coming down on the first half. Okay, and then I just lift the weight normal on the first half. Another way is adding bands, and another way is adding chains. Like, those are my favorite ways to add accommodating resistance. You can add it to you can also add to compound movements like squats. You can do it on deadlifts, which is really, really, really brutal. Again, bench press. And you can even add it to machines. Try adding a band to leg presses. It works really well.
Perfect. I think we're back and caught up now. All right, so starting questions. Are there any exercises that you can grow your glutes without activating your quads?
So this is a really good question that you get from a lot of figure competitors, because a lot of figure competitors, you don't want overdeveloped quads. You want hamstrings and glutes and back. And so some people have really good genetics when it comes to doing like exercises where they're quad dominant. So they don't so much activate their glutes. So the biggest thing to understand is that, what do the glutes do? The glutes, you have the gluteus medius and the gluteus maximus. The gluteus maximus is the large part of the muscle. It's on the back, okay, essentially of your butt. And then you have also the gluteus medius, and that's the hip part of the muscle, right, out here. So you kind of curve here, and you curve in the back. For the gluteus maximus, it's going to extend your leg directly back, and the gluteus medius is going to abduct, meaning take your leg away. It's going to move your leg outward, okay? So when you're talking about isolation type of things, you're basically talking about, a lot of that's going to be banded work. So you're going to put a band around your ankle, and you're going to move your leg directly backward. You're going to put a band around your ankle, you move it directly out to the side. Also, even though you're still going to use your quads somewhat, isolation type of movements are going to be things like glute bridges, single-legged glute bridges. Probably the ultimate glute exercise is hip thrust. That's where you sit on the ground. You're sitting on the ground, your kind of back's against a bench. You put a barbell near your waist and probably put a pad around that, and you're going to thrust your hips upward and then down, upward and down. So banded work, hip thrust, glute bridges, single-legged glute bridges. But I will also tell you this. A lot of people think that squats, again, going back to figure competitors, they think that squats is like, oh, I got to do a lot of squats because it's going to build my glutes. Squats actually are one of the best exercises for quads. They're not the best exercise for glutes. However, when you do squats, make sure you're focusing on the hips. This is where you use intent and focus. All right? So instead of just going up and down and extending your quads, you're trying to sit back and then kind of thrust forward. Sit back and kind of thrust forward, almost like you're doing a hip thrust. So you're sitting back and thrusting forward. A great way to learn how to do that is going to be box squats. You're sitting back, and then you're coming off the box and trying to start by initiating the glutes. So making activities with the glutes that you're normally doing, focusing more on the glutes, okay? Another thing that you can do is pre-activation techniques. So basically, when start off with bands before you do squats, or start off with bands before you do lunges, pre-activate the glutes. Studies show they're more activated during the actual exercise itself.
Great. Here's another good one. We use ice baths at ASPI. What are the benefits or pros and cons of ice baths?
So that's a really good question. So first off, you guys don't know what ASPI is. That's where actually we work out of. And ASPI is like a 22,000 square foot top flight laboratory performance center. Okay. Now, ice, and we have a physical therapy center here too. So ice is really good for chronic inflammation. Like, for example, I have really bad tendonitis in my elbows. It's chronic. It's long term. Ice is really good for that. You might have chronic joint pain. For joint pain and stuff like that, ice can be really, really good. There are some studies that do show, for example, though, that let's say that I were to train my legs and I really got a good training stimulus, and then I jumped in an ice bath, that acute inflammatory response that goes on in your muscles, you may not want to suppress that for the first 24 hours. So if you're doing legs and you jump right into an ice bath, it could, there's some studies that indicate it could inhibit some of the muscle growth properties. So, so again, we do use ice, but mainly it's like injuries, long-term inflammation, but don't use it like right after you do a training session on that muscle that you want to grow.
What are some of your favorite fat-burning supplements?
Well, I think, look, for fat-burning supplements, I think number one, you want to be insulin sensitive. I think berberrine's really good for that. Classic fat-burning supplements, caffeine. We were talking about that earlier today. It elevates your metabolism, but you want to make sure with caffeine that you're only using it on the hardest part of your cut, or when you're cycling off your cut. You want to make sure you only use it like 4 weeks on, then 2 weeks off. Green tea is a great fat burner, especially paired with caffeine, because caffeine works by sensitizing the adrenaline pathway. Green tea works by actually elevating adrenaline. So they work very good together. Yohimbe is actually a good one. Also actually works synergistically with caffeine and green tea. So I think that's really good. So even drinking green tea itself has some green tea and caffeine, so that could work really well. I like fiber supplements because they keep you full. People got to think about satiety. Glucomannan is my favorite fat-burning fiber supplement. When you take a couple, like 2 or 3 grams of glucomannan, like 20 minutes before you eat, you're not as hungry and you won't actually eat as much. So I do really like that as a supplement, glucomannan. So those are some of my favorite ones for like overall fat burning.
What are some ways to increase androgen receptor density?
So great question. What are some ways to increase androgen receptor density? For those of you guys who are saying, what the hell is androgen receptor density? Well, basically one of the ways that we grow is testosterone levels bind to their receptors and they tell the muscle grow, okay? One of the reasons why guys can gain more muscle than females is because they have more testosterone and more androgen receptors, okay? And one of the reasons why some very poor studies that were done out of Canada that were correlational showed that acute rise in testosterone didn't affect long-term growth is because they used people who are untrained. Because people who are highly trained, like powerlifters, have a much greater density of androgen receptors. When we first start training, the localized response to muscle growth is very prominent. As I adapt to training, I start to build up more androgen receptors around the muscle, and I can respond better to testosterone. Okay? So what studies show is one of the best things that you can do to increase androgen receptor density is going to be metabolic type of training, and that's going and or heavy training combined with burnout sets. So what happens is when I do metabolic training, like supersets, giant sets, short rest period lengths, compound movements, I create a huge amount of lactic acid, a huge amount of metabolic stress, and that seems to stimulate the nervous system and the endocrine system to release testosterone. The more of those acute bouts that happen, the better the muscle gets at using testosterone and upregulating androgen receptors. So even if you're like a power lifter and you want to increase androgen receptors, you're not so much interested in like high rep stuff. Studies show that if you do heavy lifting and then you do a burnout set at the end, that can increase androgen receptors and it'll increase muscle growth and it'll increase strength ultimately.
Cool. What are some of your favorite tips for growing triceps? My biceps are great, but my triceps are lacking.
Right. So, with triceps, I think the biggest thing with triceps is you want to hit them from every single angle that you can, okay? Basically, think about hitting them on, in essence, literally, I like hitting them from every single angle. So you want to hit them, maximize them on like a fully contracted position, and that's going to be where you're lifting heavy and you're getting in a fully contracted position, and that's going to be things like close grip bench press, okay? Then you're going to want to hit the triceps in more of a neutral position, which is going to be like cable extensions. However, you also want to train the triceps in a fully stretched position, which is going to be like overhead, dumbbell extensions, okay? And so what you're doing is you're hitting the triceps at all different angles. Again, close grip here, neutral, and then overhead. Now, why do I say overhead? The triceps have 3 heads. 2 of those heads originate on the upper arm or the humerus. 1 crosses the shoulder joint and attaches basically past the shoulder joint. That means that tricep actually works to extend the arm. You can place that muscle on stretch by placing it over your head. So French presses, overhead cable extensions, overhead dumbbell extensions, that places the triceps on stretch, particularly the long head that splits the muscle, and that's going to cause a lot of really good growth and detail in the muscle.
What do you think about like diet sodas and insulin response? I'm assuming artificial sweeteners and insulin response.
Good question. So basically, listen, I think that we have to live our lives. And when you get kind of down to the point where like, oh my God, I'm going to drink a diet soda because it's going to increase insulin and throw me out, I think it gets a little extreme. So studies show people who are healthy and generally insulin sensitive don't really get an insulin response at all to any artificial sweeteners. So if you're lifting weights and you're training, you're going to fall into that category. You're not going to get an insulin response. There are some sparse data that people who are like, people who are very insulin resistant and obese, that like sucralose, they get somewhat of an insulin response, a small one, but that data is sparse. If you're healthy and you're training really hard, you probably won't get much of an insulin response at all.
How can you isolate rectus femoris for it to be more visible?
So rectus femoris, go into the quadriceps 4 muscles, rectus femoris crosses at the hip joint, and that's that nice split. When you're shredded and you see that incredible split right down the middle of the quads, that middle head is the rectus femoris, okay? When you talk about the teardrop, that's the vastus medialis. When you talk about the outer sweep, that's the vastus lateralis. That gives you that nice sweep, that width on the quads. The teardrop's the vastus medialis. Well, rectus femoris, actually, there's a lot of studies that show leg extensions are the best exercise for rectus femoris. One of the reasons why, there's an old biomechanics paradox called like the Lombard's paradox. And basically what happens is like when I'm squatting, you kind of have like the glutes extending you, but you also have like the rectus femoris, which essentially is a hip flexor. So it's kind of countering the action of the hip extensors. So what happens when you're like doing squats, your body regulates that and doesn't allow the flexor component, which is the rectus femoris, to fully activate. But if I'm doing seated leg extensions, there's no antagonist activity to seated leg extensions. So I can actually activate the rectus femoris fully. Now, what most people don't also think about, is I've also found one of the best ways to shred and dice up the rectus femoris is like hanging leg raises. Hanging leg raises is a hip flexor movement. So if you like superset leg extensions with hanging leg raises, you actually hit that center quad quite well.
Can you talk a little bit about knee pain and how you might work around it or even kind of rehab it?
So, and fortunately, the thing about knee pain is like Mitch is like one of our top guys here. He's an expert on knee pain at Applied Science Performance Institute. So if you're local and you have knee pain, you should definitely come here and check that out. But one thing I'll say about knee pain is oftentimes you got to think about like why do you have knee pain in the first place, right? So what is impacting your knee pain? there could be certain exercise that aggravate it. Like for example, when I do hack squats, it robustly aggravates my knee pain. And so every time I try and go back to them, it does the same thing. So you need to also look at what exercises are causing that. Number two, quite honestly, most people have overdeveloped quads and underdeveloped glutes. So one way to help with your knee pain is to start focusing on your core, on your compound movements by engaging your hips more, okay? And I talked about earlier doing things like box squats, learning to sit back and come forward. You're learning to engage your hips more. The more you engage your hips, the more you take off a lot of the pressure on the knees, okay? Now, intriguingly enough, we are going to be launching a really cool, the baddest ass course that's ever been done on gaining muscle. You know, it's insane. And actually, one of the biggest components of it is training the core lifts. And Charlie is going to be taking you guys through proper squatting techniques. And by following a lot of those techniques, you're going to save your knees. So again, I would recommend to you try and engage your hips more. Is going to be a big positive, I think, for your knees.
Are animal-based proteins better in terms of bioavailability and amino acid profile compared to plant-based proteins?
The short answer of the question are animal-based proteins raise amino acid levels more than plant-based proteins? Yes. Zero question about it. In fact, we've done a lot of studies on that. So the answer is yes. You want to make sure that, like, if you're consuming plant-based proteins, you're probably gonna have a hard time gaining muscle and you have a hard time losing fat. What I will tell you is that if you are gonna consume them, and say you're a vegan and you're not gonna consume any meat or meat-based products, you must supplement with branched chain amino acids or essential amino acids. You're gonna be stuck in the mud.
Does red light therapy help muscle soreness?
So red light therapy helps with like mitochondrial biogenesis. It helps with a lot of things. Like there may be some data that suggests that if you improve mitochondria, you improve insulin sensitivity, you improve recovery, which could help with soreness. I don't think it's going to be like, I'm going to do red light therapy, oh my God, I'm going to be not so sore the next day. But I think it's a good overall health benefit and increases mitochondria and long-term energy, which could be good for long-term soreness.
How does the supplement pyruvate work?
It's interesting that you're mentioning pyruvate. I think the first time I heard about pyruvate was like 2000, like 20 years ago. It might have been in the 90s. I think pyruvate got popular in the 90s. It's interesting. Pyruvate got super popular. Now, what is pyruvate? Basically, you have this pathway in your muscles. And by the way, pyruvate was touted as the next amazing supplement to burn fat. You take pyruvate and you are guaranteed to be shredded. Now, by the way, don't quote me. Please, if someone's watching this and they clip that and put it out on social media, that was a clip. I have not explained everything yet. I'm telling you, that's what they said, right? So basically, what was the rationale behind that? I never saw one, and it didn't work. Basically, pyruvate, when you have blood sugar, your blood sugar is glucose. Glucose gets broken down in a pathway. Glucose is 6 carbons, and it's broken down into 2 3-carbon molecules, and those 2 3-carbon molecules are pyruvate. So think about glucose is split in half into 2 pyruvates. Why that would do anything positive, I don't know. Now, no, granted, you could think of pyruvate as an energy source. It is an alternative energy source. People have looked at pyruvate, for example, for people who have concussions. Giving an alternative energy source like pyruvate might help with brain energy metabolism. That could help maybe with focus. But as far as like the original thoughts of it being a fat burner, I just don't see physiologically why, and studies just didn't show it helps.
How important is stabilization training?
So that's a good question. Like if you're talking about stabilization training, like Botsu ball stuff, I don't think it's like that beneficial at all, to be honest. This is a short answer.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you have like people that just can't, like you're training older clients or something.
Yeah.
Maybe, but
yeah.
as far as athletes, I mean, you train them on a flat surface. Why would you train on a unbalanced surface.
Yeah, and also one time, man, I remember I was in college, and I was training like no, I was playing hockey. It was in Canada, and it was kind of like a shitty gym. And anyway, so I saw this dude, and he was think about it, if you're training on a Botsu ball, okay, and these were really popular like in the '90s, early 2000s. Basically, you probably shouldn't be going super heavy on this, okay? So I saw this guy go on a Botsu ball, and he took like the 120-pound dumbbells. He goes and sits back on a Botsu ball, and after rep 3, can you guess what happened? That sucker popped, okay? And it popped like crazy, and yes, that he banged his head and he got a concussion. Thank God the dumbbells didn't fall on his head, because they could have, right? So, and he passed out, and we had to revive him and stuff like that. And after that, I kind of swore off Botsu balls.
Sounds fair. So we talked about box squats today. Here we have a question asking about hip crease below the knees on box squats. Do you think there's an increased emphasis as you go lower? Is there more emphasis on the quads? And they're asking because they get knee pain when they go too low.
You know, honestly, this is a really good question. I'm gonna let Charlie hit this one. So go ahead.
Right.
He's the expert on like mechanics and squats.
All right, so the question about box squats with the hip crease, I think, again, it has to depend on what you're training for and what you're trying to avoid, right? So if you say your knees hurt when you go too low, like Doc mentioned earlier, hey, why do your knees hurt? Is that, an injury? Is it some sort of imbalance, something? Get that checked out first, because that's important. Your knees are hurting when they shouldn't be. So that's something you need to figure out there, okay? But as far as, if you don't have an injury, if it's just pain you have to work around, unless you're a competitive power lifter, you don't have to squat with your hip crease below your knees, okay? We see, activation of the quads actually peaks right around 90 degrees of knee flexion, so it's not necessary to go below parallel if it bothers you, okay? And then again, it just gets back to your goals. If you're trying to emphasize your hips in a box squat, you don't have to go below parallel, because it's easier to sit back, if you go right at parallel or even just a little above it, okay? But yeah, going lower is going to exaggerate the quads just a little bit, because it makes it more mechanically difficult on the knee, which is also why it causes your knee pain. So it's kind of a lot to consider there. Figure out why you have pain, why is it hurting, is it something you need to figure or work on, and then kind of work around it if you can. I think that covers as far as I'm concerned.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks, man.
Got it.
Thank you.
All right. How does a perfect bedtime meal and supplement look like?
How does a perfect bedtime meal and supplement look like? I mean, I like burgers, but but I think the perfect bedtime meal is something that should keep you growing while you're sleeping. So that's why I do think take burgers for example. It's got some fat in it. You know what I mean? Bacon has fat in it too, so that's going to be more of a. It'll take some time for your body to digest that. So the theory is that when you go to sleep, you're building muscle longer throughout the night. So I think one, go low carb before bed, because what happens is if I have a higher carb meal before bed, I will stop fat burning processes. So you want to go low carb, so you're building muscle and you're kind of burning fat throughout that nighttime. Because studies actually show that if I have high carbs, especially high glycemic carbs before bed, I'll wake up in the morning and actually will be fixed to carbohydrate metabolism the rest of the following day. So you want to go low carb at night. Programs you for the next day, helps you burn fat during the middle of the night, and the slower digesting, probably meat-based protein source is going to keep you growing throughout the night.
I think we have time for just a couple more.
Okay.
It's a really good one we've talked a lot on lately, though. Will ASPI have a training certification like ISSA or NASM in the future?
Oh, that's a really good question. So let me say this. ASPI is a higher institute of performance and learning, and our goal is to bring people to their prime, okay? So it is a very exclusive spot. We even in here, we started off as a research center, and now we take members, but we literally cap it at 50. And it's an application process, right? So if someone is local in Tampa and they want to train here, there's an application process. You go online, you apply. Charlie will actually be the guy to first interview you. But basically, if you get in, like, it's a full prime program. It's an elite program that transforms you. So if you're interested in ASPI and literally getting to your prime in anti-aging, I'd highly recommend coming here and checking out theaspi.com, theaspi.com. Now, again, as a higher institute of learning and performance, we're constantly educating. And I will tell you this, our ultimate goal in the future is to start like literally a graduate level program where people can literally go and get degrees from ASPI or ASPI. And that's something that will happen down the road. We are starting courses. We're building courses now. Muscle PhD is going to be launching those courses. And Muscle PhD, we will be launching a course where that will have a certification attached to that. The course itself is going to be launched in November. Now, the difference between like our course and the other certification you mentioned are really cool. The difference in our course and those other ones is that you were literally learning and becoming an expert, and you'll be certified as an expert on gaining muscle. Who covers that? You don't learn that in school. No certification caters to that. They might cater to strength, they might cater to power. No one caters to muscle. And on top of that, we have extensive information on strength and power. So yeah, through Muscle PhD and ASPI, we will be launching those types of certifications coming to you soon.
All right, I think this is a good one to finish on. Should you take creatine every other day or just days that you train on?
I mean, I don't see a reason not to take creatine every single day. Your typical protocol is load it up for 5 days, about 20 grams a day, separated in 4 or 5 servings, and then just take 3 to 5 grams a day every day. I don't really see a problem with it. Now, if you miss a serving of creatine on off days, no big deal, right? The most important is to take it during your workouts. But I don't see a problem taking it every day. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate every single one of you, and we will see you next week.